Good morning, everyone. My name is Will Pomerantz, and I'm the director of the Kennan Institute. I want to thank you all for joining us today for a discussion on how Ukraine is attempting to dismantle its colonial ties to Russia and orient towards Europe, even in the midst of a full-scale invasion. So we have three speakers. I will introduce each one of them and then give them 7 to 10 minutes to talk. And then we should have time for a discussion at the end of the presentation. So the first speaker is Volodymyr Shaiko. He is the director of the Ukrainian Institute and an expert in cultural diplomacy, cultural management, marketing, and communications. So, Volodymyr, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, William. Hello, everyone. I don't know if it's good morning or good evening, depending on where you are. I lead Ukraine's public institution for cultural diplomacy and cultural relations. So my remarks will be coming from a very practical perspective, not from an academic perspective. Although I think we'll discuss the academic side of this theme of this topic in the conversation today. But I just wanted to kick off with kind of a challenge with a challenge of this thesis, of this argument that Ukraine is only now trying to disentangle itself from Russia and reposition itself, kind of moving forward to Europe in the context of the full-scale invasion. I think that process has been going on for decades, if not centuries. And particularly today, Ukraine has actively employed a decolonial vocabulary or post-colonial and vocabulary in its strategic communications and its cultural diplomacy, particularly after the full-scale invasion began in February 2022, because I think it's a universal language, a sort of a universal language that helps Ukraine make its case to the West, but also to what we can refer to as the global South, and explain the nature of its anti-imperial and anti-colonial struggle that is obviously going on today in the course of the war. And let me remind us that the war has been going on for 10 years now, since 2014. So let's look at today's events in a slightly broader perspective. Why decoloniality matters for Ukraine today? I think it's very important to explain the war and the processes that are going on in Ukraine's identity politics, but also in its self-understanding and also external communication, because it reveals structural similarities of colonial experiences that Ukraine has with many other countries and regions across the world. Ukraine may not have been a colony in the sense that we attach this term to countries in Africa, Latin America, or South Asia, or other regions of the world. However, Ukraine was subjected to policies, to Russian Soviet policies that were colonial by nature. And Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian identity, Ukrainian history has been undermined by Russia in its various geopolitical incarnations for centuries. And these structural similarities manifested itself in the ban of Ukrainian language, in political repressions, extermination of Ukraine's intellectual elites, in forced deportations, extraction of natural resources, physical destruction of cultural assets, censorship, and other things. And that basically reduced Ukrainian culture to a very marginal and rustical position in the broader framework of the Russian Empire and later in the Soviet Union. And that's exactly the policy that contemporary Russia is trying to continue, sustain, and replicate today. However, because Russia's contiguous colonies have generally been viewed as a gradual and legitimate enlargements of Russia's territory and ethnicity, Russian culture has largely escaped the scrutiny given to Western cultural assets in the post-colonial era and in the post-colonial discourse. So I think this is why today we talk a lot about decoloniality when we speak about Ukraine's struggle for independence, for sovereignty, but also for cultural sovereignty and cultural agency that has been largely missing, I think, from international perceptions of the country in the past 30 years, but indeed before that. And this kind of moves me into the discussion of what cultural diplomacy does or can do for Ukraine today. Cultural diplomacy as a function, as a state policy, as an element of foreign policy, has been practiced by many states, for decades. It was used by state and non-state actors to exercise cultural domination, to an attempt to prevent conflict or to facilitate post-conflict reconciliation. It was employed to correct a negative image of a country. It was used to establish a more pronounced cultural influence that supplemented traditional diplomacy. And all of that is a legitimate way cultural diplomacy has been practiced across the world until today. However, for Ukraine, I think cultural diplomacy today means more than that. It has become, and I think it's increasingly recognized within the country as a very important factor of national security, and one of the safeguards of its political and cultural agency, and even a tool of deterrence against malignant influence, disinformation policies, and aggressive cultural influences projected by Russia. So in today's circumstances, and having this decolonial perspective and vocabulary in mind, the main objective, I would argue, of Ukraine's cultural diplomacy today is to employ its cultural assets and narratives to help Ukraine regain its agency in international affairs, to address false stereotypes and disinformation, to Ukrainian cultural oeuvre and heritage that is misattributed to other cultures, and ultimately project Ukraine's own voice and narratives through various forms of artistic expression and academic research and exchange. And I think ultimately our objective would be to do so not in opposition to Russia or its culture, because the reference point of these efforts should be placed within Ukraine. And this is something that Svetlana alluded to in one of her articles, that for Ukraine, indeed, this war marks not only the country's release from post-colonial entanglements, but it marks a definitive entrance into the decolonial stage of the discourse. Practically, to conclude, what can cultural diplomacy do against this backdrop for Ukraine? It should work, and it works already, with reattribution and reappropriation of cultural assets, a more thorough and objective study of artists and cultural phenomena. It means decolonization of programming policies of international cultural institutions. It means challenging what constitutes an international cultural canon. And just to give you an example, the Ukrainian Institute and the British Council and ICOM, the International Committee of Museums, are working now on a very practical tool that would help achieve exactly that. It's a decolonial guide for museums that will help curators be more effective in cataloging, labeling, and contextualizing Ukrainian history and heritage. And this guide will offer very practical solutions to several key questions. How do we identify Ukrainian cultural heritage? How do we describe historically changing state borders? How do we avoid inappropriate language, terminology, and labeling? And how do we fairly represent contested heritage? And all of that can then be translated directly into acquisitions policies, into curatorial policies, into the way international museums work with their collections or present and exhibit art from different countries. Cultural diplomacy, I think, should promote a principle: nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, and that means integration of Ukrainian voices, Ukrainian opinions, and presence of Ukrainian culture makers, scholars, intellectuals, and other actors into international discourse, into discussion forums, into conferences, into various knowledge production networks and points where Ukraine has been largely absent from until very recently. It can also mean decolonial rereading and re-examination of literature, of music, of visual art, of various other forms of artistic expression, and to actually research and track sometimes hidden or invisible influences that culture and literature has had on policies, on mentality, on social beliefs, and ultimately leading to such tragic events as are unfolding in Ukraine today. Cultural diplomacy for Ukraine can also, I think, should, not just can, but should also explore its cultural, religious, and social diversity, particularly that pertaining to indigenous peoples of Ukraine, such as Crimean Tatars. I think it's also a very powerful tool to dismantle some of the stereotypes and some of the preconceptions the world may have about Ukraine. And of course, it also has to do with correction of historical narratives, a thorough and careful and meaningful correction of some of the damaging or harmful narratives that have traditionally or historically undermined Ukraine or denigrated Ukraine's identity, history, and culture. So this is kind of a set, I think, of very practical tools that are at disposal of cultural diplomacy for Ukraine. And of course, the actors that can be involved in such activities are plenty. It's not just one state organization that has to do that. The field of cultural diplomacy includes many other actors, such as individual artists, such as cultural institutions, scholars, and international academic centers, various other knowledge production centers, diplomats. There is a great deal of stakeholders involved in that activity. And I think decoloniality and decolonial apparatus, I think, provides us with that platform that can help Ukraine achieve its strategic communications and other political objectives today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Volodymyr. I have just a brief question, which is, I think, very expansive, but you've talked about it in your presentation. So in light of deportations, language policies, et cetera, what do you think, how did Ukrainian culture survive over 250, 300 years in light of the repression and multiple attempts at repression by the Russian Federation?
That's a very good question, and I think we often ask this question to ourselves here in Ukraine. How on earth did we survive having endured all of this? But I think that's the answer is that Ukraine's agency and culture and identity historically has been too strong to crumble under such policies. And this is what Ukrainian writer Oksana Zabushko once said, that it came as a surprise to the world that Ukraine survived the first few days and then months and years.
We're freezing up. Sorry about this, Volodymyr. We've lost you. We lost you for about 20 seconds.
20 seconds. Okay. Well, I don't know where you stopped hearing me, but what I was quoting a Ukrainian writer, Oksana Zabushko, who said that in the aftermath of the full-scale invasion, the world may have attached very little agency to Ukraine and to its people. And however, Ukraine has always had this agency, has always had this strength and resilience in its society and its intellectual elites to be able to withstand all the totalitarian policies that it was subjected to. So I think that's partly an answer to your question.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Andrei Portnov. He is the professor of entangled history of Ukraine. He has been awarded several prizes, including the Dialogue Prize of the German-Polish Society for his commitment to the dissemination of knowledge about Ukraine. So, Andrei, floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, dear Will, dear colleagues. First of all, if I may, let me use this occasion, being at least virtually at the Kennan Institute, to briefly mention our new institution I'm representing, which is the Viadrina Center of Polish and Ukrainian Studies. That's the only, believe me or not, that's the only and single German universities-based academic institution, research institution, which focuses and brings together Polish and Ukrainian studies. And I am also, as you've just heard, the only professor of Ukrainian history in Germany. And actually, why the only, it's an interesting question, kind of related to our topic. We could discuss it later on if you find it interesting. Also, our university is very special because I'm sure that not everybody knows that actually Viadrina is, again, the only German university which is literally physically located on both sides of the Oder River, so in Poland and in Germany. Why it's so important? I think it's important because like what we're trying to do, I mean, me and my colleagues, we're trying to build intellectually, of course, this new kind of triangle. Ukraine, Poland, Germany. And it's a rather new approach, especially if you look back, let's say, on the existing historiography and tradition of thinking and writing about our part of Europe. And what I'm planning to do now, dear colleagues, I'll just share maybe 3 comments, very brief, about the description of our event presented by the Kennan Institute, and hopefully it will provoke, some discussion, some thinking about the issues. So the first notion used there was Ukraine's path towards Europe. I would dare to say that Ukraine is and was part of Europe. Of course, if you define Europe not as a European Union, right, so like a certain legal international institution, but geographically, culturally. And actually this belonging to Europe, I would say, could explain a lot of interesting things, events in Ukrainian history. And nowadays, I am afraid it would be important in European debates, like in German debate, for instance, where I am like involved for 10 years now, to still ask oneself rather, let's say, unpleasant but important question, something like that: what Europe could lose by losing Ukraine? Because it seems so obvious that like Ukraine is there, Ukraine will always want to be part of the EU, will always, wait like for decades, for centuries. But actually, history is not about like always and forever. It's much more about change, dynamics, and so on. And I think like this, like understanding or sensitivity to the fragile position of Ukraine is kind of, is not enough, is missing maybe. Good. So the second notion used in the text was re-examination of contested history. So as a historian, I believe and actually I hope that history should always be contested. Otherwise, it's not so interesting anymore, and it's nothing bad about it. Actually, it should be contested. It should be confronted. At least that's what I'm trying to also teach my students to do. But, dear colleagues, what is the real serious question here? When we are talking about some kind of return to national narrative, more or less classical. I would like to leave this question, open, maybe a rhetorical one, because I think it's an important, let's say, intellectual exercise for all of us to think what should or could replace the existing master narrative, the predominantly, let's say, Russia-centric narrative, for instance, of the imperial and Soviet history. In other words, the question is like how we define and conceptualize the Soviet Union as an empire or as a multinational state which almost solved national questions. And actually thinking about it and about again, returning to nation history, let me remind you, dear colleagues, a quote by Marko Pavlyshin, a prominent Ukrainian and Australian literary scholar who was actually one of the first to implement post-colonial theory to Ukrainian literature. And Marko once said something very interesting. I'm quoting him. So he said, there must be readiness in the formerly colonizing culture to acknowledge its predations. Think about it. In other words, an ideal, at least, intellectual precondition for it should be a deep, let's say, internal, in our case, Russian, reconstruction and rethinking of its cultural heritage. I am afraid it's not what we are experiencing right now, but again, let's keep it in mind as a kind of mindset for the future debate. And the next point here, if you look back, that's actually what I've did a couple of months ago, looking back at the colonial topic in Ukrainian history writing. We'll see that in the late 19th and early 20th century, it was actually very much promoted by Ukrainian socialist and Marxist thought. And those people who did that, they were mostly killed during the Stalinist purges, of course. But still, this very interesting background, once again, socialist and Marxist, who knows, maybe gives us also some way to think about this potential re-examination of contested history. Good. And the third observation. So we have in the description of our panel this nowadays pretty obvious notion of colonial past. I would allow myself to remind you, if I may, that actually historically speaking, this notion of colonial past, in case of Ukrainian history, could and should be applied not only to Russia, right? It could be applied to Polish politics or not. It's like a question mark. It could be a question mark. So let's think about it. Maybe to the Ottoman politics, because let's not forget that a huge part of present-day Ukraine in the south was part of the Ottoman Empire for centuries. And last but not least, Germany, like a country where I'm sitting now. In German narratives on the First World War and then Second World War, you clearly have this colonial attitude towards Ukraine. Now, how it is what implications do we have out of it nowadays? You know that after years of fighting, only recently, and not actually all of them, but some German media and some German academic journals, they agreed to use Ukrainian transliterations of geographical names. So now, I am allowed to write Kyiv, and I will not be automatically corrected into Kiev, as it was done till very recently. And it happened, not because they read my articles or articles of my colleagues, German or non-German. It happened, of course, because of the war, because of this enormous amount of suffering. Yeah. And I would say that's, at least for me, that's something very, very sad, because, we as intellectuals, we are supposed to give ideas, to project something, and then convince. And it was not we, it was, crimes, war crimes committed by the Russian army. And actually the same problem, like this reluctance, for instance, in Germany, to be more open, at least Ukrainian terminology. It has a lot to do with the notion of Ukrainian voices already mentioned here. Because if Ukrainian voices, if we understand Ukrainian voices as, like emotional, biased supplement, yeah, to make a talk of serious, unbiased, neutral experts more interesting, that's actually what we usually have until nowadays. My personal experience, dear colleagues, seriously, that's my personal experience for 10 years in Germany. Then I would dare to say this decolonizing approach should not be limited to Russia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I neglected to introduce and to tell you how you can ask questions to our panelists. But to our virtual audience, if you have questions for our speaker, you can submit them via the Q&A function on Zoom. Please include your name and affiliation when asking questions. Finally, let's hear from Svetlana Berdyeva. She is an art historian, curator, and artist. Her research focuses on contemporary art in Ukraine, decoloniality, and Russia's ongoing war against Ukraine.
So thank you so much, William, for inviting me to this beautiful event. And it's really a pleasure to listen to all the speakers. And I will try to be concise. I just was trying to develop some ideas precisely related to the title of this panel, of how Ukraine can be at the same time decolonial and Eurocentric. And this derives from my work as an art historian, who focuses on contemporary Ukrainian visual culture and contemporary Ukrainian art from a point of view of post-colonial theory and decolonial theory. And there is such a current in decolonial theory that is very present and very visible, that actually says that the history of colonialism and the extended coloniality into the contemporary time is always Eurocentric. And then we encounter a particular paradox when we speak about Ukraine, because usually we look at Ukrainian recent processes of decolonial disentanglement as processes of let's say, a disentanglement from Russian colonial influences and getting closer to Europe. And this paradox actually was created a big gap in academic research, particularly in the 1990s, when Ukraine was omitted from this large picture in which Global South was included, Latin America was included as those who suffered from European colonialism of the past. Ukraine didn't fit into this worldview and into this particular model. This has been pointed out by several scholars, such as Ukrainian literary scholar Vitaly Chernetsky, who was speaking about it as early as in the early 2000s, and post-colonial scholar Gayatri Spivak. Also, she particularly remarked that there is this invisibility of Ukraine's coloniality or former colonial belonging within Soviet Union and the Russian Empire as its predecessor. So bridging this gap is an important task because certainly there should be some methodology and some terminology developed to create a model that would, let's say, kind of change or transform this system of global coordinates. One of important moments of Ukrainian Eurocentric orientation was, of course, the Maidan Revolution of 2014, which started with the Eurocentric statements as the initial trigger. But I propose that it developed with the ongoing processes of resistance to the government of Viktor Yanukovych to something much stronger, something much wider, and something much more impactful. And it gave way to a decolonial turn in Ukrainian culture and in Ukrainian society. As an art historian, I wrote several texts speaking about how actually this decolonial turn was reflected first in the production of new epistemologies and new knowledge in Ukrainian society, particularly in the engagement of Ukrainian filmmakers, Ukrainian artists into the documentation of the events of the war. Then the creation of personal chronicles when the full-scale invasion began in 2022, and kind of this relation between personal experiences of artists and cultural producers with the rest of Ukrainian society, and the following reflection and interpretation of all this change already in the recent months, let's say, in the recent 2 years, following 2023. This decolonial change contributed to the creation of new disentangled epistemologies, but also it helped to relook, to reinterpret, to reconsider some links that were initially lost in the past as they were eliminated as part of Ukrainian colonial belonging, particularly during the times of the Soviet Union. Here I would like to rely on one recent discussion with Professor Miroslav Shkandrij, who proposed that the usual model that we use when speaking about development of culture and society after the collapse of colonialism, which is seen as colonialism, anti-colonialism, post-coloniality, and then the decoloniality as this kind of final process, can be amended to a model which includes certain elements which are decolonial that emerge at any point of all this process, from colonial belonging to post-colonial transformation to decolonial disentanglement. And basically, my statement is that if we look at the history of Ukrainian culture in the 20th century, particularly in the times of the Soviet Union and repressions produced by Russia's centralized state in the Soviet Union over Ukrainian culture, we can find these decolonial elements. And these decolonial elements, they were largely Eurocentric. I selected 2 examples. I wanted to show some photos, but of course, we don't have time for the images, but I will discuss them briefly. One is the important case of the school of Mikhailo Boychuk, who was an artist, a monumentalist artist working in the early 20th century. In Ukraine, he traveled to Europe, he studied in Europe, he presented his works in Paris, he traveled across different countries, and practically he repeated this track that Diego Rivera, important artist of Mexican muralism, did approximately at the same time, when Diego Rivera was very inspired, for example, by frescoes of Giotto, of Italian proto-Renaissance, and then brought this aesthetics already into the development of Mexican muralism. The same process happened with Mikhailo Boychuk. He investigated, researched, he brought this conceptual vision, he brought the aesthetics to first to Lviv, where he arrived in 1910, and then in 1917 he arrived to Kiev. Originally, he was actually born in Austro-Hungarian Empire, but he worked in Kiev starting from 1917. He helped to found Ukrainian Art Academy, where he taught monumental art. Then in 1937, something happened. All his circle was accused of promoting foreign influences in their art, which didn't align with the ideals of socialist realism, of Stalinist socialist realism. And his wife, Sofia Lipinska, his students, Vasil Sedlar and Ivan Padelka, they were all killed in 1937. Subsequently, their murals were erased. And the reason was that basically he applied this Byzantine and to certain extent Renaissance aesthetics in his work, which was not acceptable by colonial rule of Russia and the Stalinist regime. If their work could receive kind of support of development, similarly to Mexican muralism, they would have in Ukraine a phenomenon very similar in magnitude to what Mexico has with its muralist legacy. This is one example. Another example is the artist Alla Horska from the 1960s generation. She worked also with monumental art. She didn't know much about the school of Mikhailo Baichuk because, of course, the information was quite erased together with the murals, and she relied, according to the memoirs of her son, Alexei Zaretsky, she relied much on the publications that she was receiving from the countries of the Eastern Bloc, such as Czechoslovakia, some Polish publications, German publications, to get acquainted with movements of European avant-garde and the concurrent movements and currents of art in the 1960s in Europe. And she applied this knowledge in her work. And a similar situation happened when she created a stained glass window for the National University in Kiev. This stained glass window was accused of representing this very foreign, also Byzantine, also kind of very European references, together with being accused of presenting nationalist references, and it was demolished almost immediately. The artist herself was killed in 1970 by KGB after she signed a letter to Leonid Brezhnev calling for reconsideration of the policy of repressions against political repressions against dissidents in the Soviet Union. So these are these two examples that show that actually the only way of that equated free expression and led to some kind of experimentation, led to, let's say, decolonial gesture in Ukrainian culture, at least in the times of the Soviet Union, was very much linked with looking at Europe and looking at the West. This is also pretty much supported by the fact that Ukraine was always considered as some kind of Western outpost of the Russian Empire, and together with the Baltics, for example, it was considered kind of more European than the rest of all this imperial formation. And this also brings us to this idea that Ukraine undoubtedly is Europe, but also Ukraine has this particular borderline quality that permits it this filtering function of being under colonial influences from the East and being under certain cultural influences from the side of the West. But the way how these influences are absorbed, how they're interpreted, and how they're transformed, they precisely create this basis for Ukrainian current decoloniality. Well, I speak from the perspective of an art historian, so I speak analyzing more visual culture. But I think that visual culture is also very representative of how Ukrainian society functions and how Ukrainian society develops throughout these decades of colonial belonging, anti-colonial resistance, post-colonial transformation, and decolonial release, and this new anti-colonial resistance prompted by the Russian neocolonial. So this is something that I wanted to remark. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Svetlana. Just a reminder to our audience, our virtual audience, if you have questions for our speakers, you can submit them via the Q&A function on Zoom. And we have several questions already. I will ask the first question, though, and it goes back to the question of language. And to what extent has Russia, in so many ways, incurred the wrath of its formerly Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine? I talk about Kharkiv, Odessa, and so forth. So to what extent has Russia been primarily one of the most exponents, not exponents, but actors who have allowed certain parts of Ukraine, which were considered Russian-speaking, to now be anti-Russian because of this war? Is that a fair comment, or has Russia basically lost its empire already simply because it has attacked what it perceived as its the greater Russian population that was in Ukraine?
Can I just quickly respond to that? I think indeed it's achieved exactly the opposite. I think in Ukraine, from what it declared as the kind of ideological reasoning behind the invasion, with a lot of people across the country switching into Ukrainian, and we see other kind of repercussions of this in Ukraine. For example, Russian used to be a dominant language of the Ukrainian business. So just 5 or 10 years ago, business relations and written correspondence in the Ukrainian business community was mostly done in Russian. And now it's completely the opposite. So now it's all Ukrainian. I mean, I haven't heard so much Ukrainian language in the streets of various Ukrainian cities from Kharkiv to Lviv as lately. But I think in this describing this phenomenon, I think it's very important to remember, to understand that what is often referred to as the Russian-speaking regions of Ukraine were not Russian in the past. The Russian language was brought into the Ukrainian lands through violence, through colonization, and through various sorts of coercive policies inflicted on these lands. So it's not that we are getting rid of something that is innately Ukrainian. I think Ukrainians are just going back to their roots in so many ways, and their own past and their own history. And it is a very much a conscious decision on behalf of these people on their way to their identity. As simple as that.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Dana Ear, and she says that all states have events and actors and periods in their past that don't align with current values and aims. How does Ukraine acknowledge and limit the impact of such moments in its national narrative effort? So who wants to take a crack at that one?
perhaps Andrei, no?
I'm sorry, dear colleagues, I'm typing answers to some like specific questions asked me. So if I may, I'll just finish doing that. And yeah, maybe Svetlana or Volodya, yeah, will have some immediate responses to that.
Well, I rather had a reply to the previous question about the language, because
Okay.
I think I could add maybe some kind of small remark that for me it was interesting to read in the book of Katerina Zaremba about Ukrainian East, where that she remarks that actually this is a stereotype that Russian language of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions was some kind of a pretext, an important pretext that had some kind of profound reasoning for Russia's trying to invade and trying to establish some connection based precisely on this language, on the basis of language. She proposes that for long, Russian language in the Donetsk and Lugansk regions developed very differently, and is visibly a different way of speaking, and is quite visibly different vocabulary from that type of Russian that is spoken in Russian territory. So she, as a person from the Ukrainian East, she proposes precisely this idea that we need to address all these linguistic characteristics and linguistic particularities in every individual local context, and not to use them as some kind of all unifying phenomenon or all unifying characteristic. And for me, it was quite interesting, because this actually brings much to think about whether there is one single Russian language, or there are many different Russian languages spoken in different regions, and how do we need to address it within this context of neocolonial aggression.
So we have another question for Svetlana, and this comes from Nicholas Bravo. And he says, I understand that you have suggested the limitations of implementing certain theory as if it was a recipe. What is the background of colonial and post-colonial perspectives in the history of art in Ukraine?
Thank you for the question. Is a very is a difficult question. Well, there are limitations for both post-colonial theory and decolonial theory in interpretation of not only art, but culture at large and Ukrainian society at large. The problem here is that there is no currently developed appropriate methodology that would gather together all these elements that are missing out in terms of how to describe things, how to analyze them. This methodology is precisely currently in development, because there are a number of Ukrainian scholars, both art historians and from different other disciplines, working in elaborating this methodology. Because if we think about decolonial theory as applied to Latin America, for example, we see a very different image because of all these dichotomies produced by the Cold War, for example, how they are applied in the region of Latin America, because of all this distance from the former colonizer, and how these relations were formed, is nothing similar to the situation of coexistence first, next to the immediate colonizer over centuries. Second, to belonging for decades to this structure that was supposed to be anti-imperialist structure of the Soviet Union. And this is what Vitaly Chernetsky calls Ukraine. He calls Ukraine post-colonial in the Second World. So this subverts all possible existing models. And this is something that really needs rethinking and needs a lot of work for
Honey?
further
Honey?
conceptualization of this. Yes, so in terms of Ukrainian art and Ukrainian culture, of course, we can rely on more kind of conventional art historical analysis or theories that are not particularly related to post-colonial or decolonial theories, such as, for example, Piotr Petrovsky horizontal art history, which calls precisely to consider every cultural phenomenon in its own unique context. But also we need to develop further.
You're on mute, William, I think. I think, meanwhile, shall I just take the next question, which is, I think, for me, about how can Western allies of Ukraine best support its effort to assert its cultural agency and sovereignty? Well, I think, first of all, that agency and sovereignty has to be recognized and acknowledged and attached to Ukraine in the first place. Secondly, when it comes to sort of cultural diplomacy and cultural presence of Ukraine in the world, I think it's very important to, like I said, to rethink the cultural canon and the traditional programming strategies of major Western institutions such as museums, festivals, research centers, and other places where culture can be either produced or showcased. From my experience, I often see, and through the work of the Ukrainian Institute, how difficult it is to persuade our potential partners to perform a Ukrainian symphony or to put up an exhibition of Ukrainian art or do any other cultural intervention, because Ukrainian culture isn't just not being seen as agent, as sufficient, as interesting or appealing enough, and quite often that space that doesn't go to host Ukrainian content often hosts Russian content, unfortunately, because there is much more agency that is being attached to Russian culture in the minds of so many people and culture makers. So. I think it's crucial to rethink that canon and to give voice and space to those cultures and those communities that have suffered from colonial policies and are struggling to emancipate today.
I'm back here. So I have another question from Victoria Savtruk. And she asked, what are your thoughts on Ukraine being referred to as a post-Soviet or post-communist country? Do you believe Ukraine should emphasize in its narratives that the Soviet times were one of occupation?
No, I could just say, actually, dear colleagues, I'm sorry. I hope you've got my answers. I've tried my best, at least very briefly, to touch upon them. You could find more actually in my book on Dnipro, for instance, which was published recently in Boston, and it was actually done exactly in this direction: how history of Ukraine could be told in entangled way with, Jewish, Russian, Polish, Ottoman history. Good. So post-Soviet, this term is largely criticized nowadays. As we all know, it's not like fashionable anymore. I would say every scholar should decide for him or herself whether it still makes sense maybe in a particular research, to be used in particular research. What's about a real problem, dear colleagues? And that's maybe not a question to us, so to say, but for the understanding of the context. Because if official Ukraine, again, not historians, but Ukrainian state, so to say, yeah, if Ukrainian state will start talking about the entire Soviet period of history as a period of occupation, yeah, Russian occupation or whatever, then we should also look for serious answers to questions like what to do with the 9th of May, or what to do with the achievements of, let's say, Soviet rocket industry in my native city of Dnipro, because nowadays it is integrated into this new Ukrainian canon. But of course, it was also part of, Soviet industrial politics, Cold War, and stuff like that. In other words, it could not be done so easily if we are talking about, let's say, serious history writing or even serious politics. You could not just get rid of those contradictions, in a way like that. Because, like, imagine if you are working in Ukrainian embassy in Berlin and you have to decide what to do on the 9th of May, or the 8th of May, 9th of May, so the day of the end of the Second World War. And think about it seriously, dear colleagues, that on the one hand, Ukrainian state tries to convince the German society that it was not Russia, but Ukraine who suffered the most, together with Poland and Belarus, from the Nazi occupation, right? And on the other hand, it has to answer the question where to put this Soviet experience in the Ukrainian narrative. So in other words, I think that serious discussion about especially Soviet past is one of the biggest challenges for this post-colonial approach in Ukrainian history writing. It is possible, but it requires serious thinking and not just, doing something without seeing all the possible implications of it. At least that's my impression. And of course, if somebody would say that present-day Ukraine is post-Soviet, the usage of this term explains very little, if anything at all, in what is going on. That's the point again. Maybe it explains something in 1991. If you say that Ukraine in 1991 is post-Soviet, could be. Again, it's a historical question. But Ukraine nowadays is, it's something else. It's much more, and it's much more complex and much more interested. Actually, the same applies to Russian speaking. I would say that's a very tricky category. Should be very careful with it. Very, very careful indeed. So if you use it, we should really be aware of all the contexts and, ideas behind it. Because just saying Russian speaking is the same as saying post-Soviet. It's reproducing this, old-fashioned narrative, which actually denies the agency of Ukraine.
Can I just
So
quickly
go
say
ahead.
that equally, I agree with Andrei on these post-Soviet and post-communist definitions, but I think equally, Eastern Partnership is a very problematic and obsolete definition that emerged as a very practical instrument of the European Union's foreign policy towards its Eastern neighboring countries. But that collection of countries doesn't mean much today. I think we are beyond that definition by far. Similarly, other terms coined and used widely or less widely, such as the New East, or even the term Eastern Europe, I think is very problematic today, because again, it doesn't do justice to the geopolitical realities of today's Europe, and there is a lot of voices in Ukraine, but also in countries like Poland, that we must redefine what constitutes Eastern Europe, and we must revisit the term Central Europe instead to have this kind of a broader definition that suits our needs of today.
I just wanted to add one thing that
Yes.
in my texts I argue that post-Soviet space fell apart at the precise moment when Russia decided to invade Ukraine, and that's how all this seemingly historical unity became dismantled, and how all this decolonial disentanglement began. So, some colleagues do not agree with me, of course, but I think if you search for some kind of precise starting moment when post-Soviet space ceased to exist, that would be year 2014.
So we've had a lot of questions, and I thank everyone who has typed their answers, because some of the questions have now disappeared on my screen. Here's one question from Patricia Vaughn, and this will be the last question. It's a comment. Some years ago, I chose a Ukrainian Canadian history and culture half course just to fill out my schedule. it changed the entire direction of my studies. I continue these years later to be a proponent of Ukrainian culture and history. So to what extent is Ukrainian history being taught in Western countries or even Ukraine? And some people have asked what really unifies Ukraine from a very disjointed history. So I'll leave that as the last question. And everyone can answer.
I could tell dear colleagues, I'm teaching Ukrainian, not only Ukrainian, Polish, Jewish history of Eastern Europe in different German universities for 10 years now. I should admit it was always received with a great interest, even before the Maidan, actually, even before the Maidan. And I do believe that actually Ukrainian studies, they have this enormous potential for interaction, rethinking of the fields we have. Like, for instance, the Jewish history of Europe or the Ottoman history, of course, no doubt about it, like Crimea and this entire story of Russian, Turkish wars and stuff like that. In other words, at least for me, Ukraine is, of course, like a subject of itself and historical cultural agent, but it is also, Ukrainian topics, Ukrainian, let's say, focuses of our research. It also could be a great and fascinating vehicle to change the existing, let's say, like mainstream questions on narratives. So if you would like to think in a new way about identities, about gender, about social history, stuff like that, please read more about Ukraine and you'll be surprised how enlightening it could be. Thank you very much.
Svetlana, do you want to comment on that last question? Or Volodymyr?
Well, I can recall a very sort of different experience. Once I was told by a US-based scholar in a discussion panel similar to this one, that he said that Ukraine's history was, until very recently, was basically one history with Russia. So I think that is quite a popular misconception when it comes to Ukrainian history, that it's so closely entangled with the Russian history that the two are pretty much inseparable. And I think that's a false assumption and a very grave misconception that thankfully is being dismantled by a lot of historians who work and have been working on Ukrainian issues lately. So I think the international academia has a long way to go to, again, disentangle Ukraine from this very Russia-centric historical narrative and frameworks of learning and knowledge production that still exist in particularly in Western academia today.
Svetlana, you can have the last word.
Well, just a brief comment that, yes, I agree with Volodymyr that actually much work still needs to be done in order to disentangle Ukrainian history from Russian history, particularly in the ways how it is presented in the study programs in European and in American universities. And this is not a brief process. This is a very long-term process which implies a lot of work, and I think that precisely the last several years they gave some kind of a good start for this process of reinterpretation. But of course, this process needs to be continued, and the relevant study programs, the relevant institutional initiatives need to be created in order to support it.
Thank you, Svetlana. And yes, this discussion needs to be continued, but unfortunately, we've run out of time for today. So I want to thank all of our speakers, all of our questioners, And finally, I want to thank the Global Europe program who co-sponsored the event today. So thank you all for coming, and thank you for your excellent presentations. And we will continue this discussion on several occasions at the Kennan Institute. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.